been a rough week or so maintaining the whole spoiler train. I feel like every time I go into public, I need a muzzle just because of the sheer amount of spoilers that exist in this Star Wars movie. So luckily, I took some precautions. Rise of... Obviously, if you haven't seen it yet, stop here because the spoiler train is going to start in 3, 2... Rise of Palpatine. This does kind of kill two birds with one stone in a sense, because one of the big arguments about Rey was that she was way too overpowered. And I really wasn't in that camp for The Force Awakens. I feel like everything in The Force Awakens, I feel like she's very contained. I don't think she was doing anything that was too wild and everything, But then The Last Jedi happened, and she still wasn't trained, and she was able to do a ridiculous amount of things with the Force, and she was extremely well tuned, and I felt like that was a little odd. And then this movie, she's had training, which I'm so happy they finally did that. And Leia has been training her. I have so many feelings regarding Leia. I cried again after seeing the movie, and all of her scenes made me cry. I felt like they handled Carrie Fisher so well. But getting back to Palpatine, because that is the big thing that's just been boggling my mind for so long. There are some things in this movie where you're kind of like, wow, I really wish we had more time to explore that, and I wish we knew more about that, because this movie makes it evident that they did not have the time they needed to do it. It kind of makes me wish we broke apart from the trilogy thing and kind of went towards just doing two movies. This should have been 2 movies. Because I think if all of this had the build-up, if the Rey Palpatine thing had the ability to have that seed planted, poor wording, I'm so sorry, it could have been easily accepted by other people. I thought that if we had seen more signs earlier, or not even that, if we had kind of gotten more from Palpatine in the past instead of having him sort of pop out of thin air. One of the things that annoyed me a little bit upon my rewatch, that did annoy me when I watched it the first time, was that they literally are like, somehow he came back. And I felt like that was just really weird. The whole beginning part, there's a ton of exposition, because this movie, as I said in my non-spoiler review, makes it very clear that they do not have a lot of cohesion. One of my biggest complaints about this trilogy in general is that it was very evident, I think, that there wasn't a general plan, that there wasn't a write-up of how this was supposed to end in a way. Once I come to accept that, I'm like, okay, well, Palpatine is the embodiment of the dark side in a way. Darth Sidious, he does he's the apprentice that he references in the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise, so it makes sense that he's the embodiment of the Sith, and I'm able to accept that. And in Legends, Palpatine comes back a ton of times, and there's in cloning and other methods as well, and it's referenced in this movie and everything. They're kind of just like, I don't know, man, it might have been cloning, it could have been anything, and we're just like, all right, he's back, I guess. But the Palpatine stuff, I thought that visually it's amazing. It's haunting and creepy, and it looks like a horror movie in a way, and his fingers are all broken and gross and everything, and he clearly his little trip down the Death Star tunnel did him some damage, and he did die during that. We've gotten confirmation that did kill him, so he was brought back to life. And I actually did enjoy the fact that Snoke is just made by Palpatine, and they show a test tube of Snoke that he was created physically. It does give enough of a backstory of Snoke, not backstory, but more an explanation as to why he happened, and that this has been the puppeteering of Palpatine the entire time. It's not out of character for Palpatine to be in the shadows and not exactly at the limelight, especially if he's been weak and he's been trying to build himself up. I thought that was well done, and I thought that made sense in terms of what we've seen before. It is disappointing that we didn't really get the Palpatine reveal in the last movie, because if you were going to kill off Snoke, who's the main big villain, I do think that it would have been the time to indicate that Palpatine was coming back, as opposed to having to squish that reveal in the opening credits of this movie. I don't like the Final Order stuff, and I don't like the way they use the Sith in this movie. What I mean by that is that they turn the Sith into like being the equivalent of the Empire, when the Sith is not a government. The Sith is not like a flagship that you wave, you know. Either it's like saying the Jedi are, you know. They're both religions, and even though the Jedi in the Clone Wars era and the Republic era by extension kind of become soldiers in a way, they're not really meant to be that way. They're meant to be peacekeepers, and the Sith are their own religious opposite, basically. They are not peacekeepers. I liked that he was the embodiment of the Sith and everything, and the idea that he had this entire arena, basically, of Sith. I liked that, but I didn't like that they turned it into a weird flagship government thing, and they're like, oh, the allies, the Sith are gonna do great for us, or whatever, and it just felt strange, because that's never what they were. The Sith were always kind of this, like, little cult, basically, and it was never this big inclusive movement, and maybe that's why they failed all this time, because they can't work with other people, but it just felt weird. I didn't like that. I think it kind of went back on previous lore that we've seen before. It would have been enough, I think, just to have the First Order and just to have more people like that General Pride guy, actually, who is a new character in this, but reminded me, he gave me some serious Tarkin vibes. I was here for it. Yeah, like, I actually am one of the very minority, and I think I like the Rey Skywalker thing. It kind of reminds me how in the end of Titanic, if you haven't seen Titanic, spoiler alert, the boat sinks, and Rose makes it out alive. In both Star Wars and in this. But in Titanic, Rose takes Jack, Leonardo DiCaprio's last name, because she identifies with him and his family, and she loved him, and it was supposed to be a tribute to him in a way. That's kind of what Rey does in the end of this movie. She claims herself as a Skywalker, and a lot of people hate that because they're like, oh, well, she's not a Skywalker, she's a Palpatine, and she should own up to that. Or she should just go back to just being Rey. And, like, I understand that argument in a sense, because it is kind of like, all right, well, we didn't see her spend as much time with the Skywalkers as we should have, but it is heavily implied that she has been, not even implied, she is Leia's apprentice in this movie, which feels so sweet to say, but she is Leia's apprentice in this movie. She spent a good amount of time with her, and she did have an impact from Luke Skywalker, and even Ben, who's a Skywalker as well. And I think that this idea of her not being a Skywalker and everything like that, these arguments about it, I think it invalidates the one of the few overarching themes of this trilogy, and that is that blood does not define you, and where you come from does not define you. And I thought that her looking into the distance and getting the approval, essentially, from Luke and Leia was fitting, because that's her adoptive family in a sense, you know? Even though Rey wasn't essentially raised by these people, she wasn't raised by anyone, and she didn't have anyone, like, so Leia is, and Luke, by extension, are probably the most, like, formative people she had in terms of who she is. Leia told her to never be afraid of who she is, and I think that's she means on the inside, you know, because Leia, we find out, has known this whole time that Rey is a Palpatine. And a lot of people are also saying in retaliation, well, why wasn't Leia as accepting of Ben, her son, and everything like that? Like, Han has that line in The Force Awakens saying there's too much Vader in him. But Leia never believes that. And I don't think Leia ever lost hope in him entirely. Otherwise, she wouldn't have given her life for him. His redemption worked for me. It actually did. I thought that he became who he's supposed to be this entire time. I really didn't think they were going to work the redemption thing. I think because it was so heavily through Leia, and with the help of Rey and his memory of Han Solo, which, by the way, he's in there, which I never thought I would ever see. The change in him is evident, you know? Like, I think Ben didn't ever think he could ever come home. I feel vindicated in a sense when it comes to how Ben Solo was treated, especially with how he talked to Han, and the weight of that moment after Leia brings him back. People are saying that Rey is Ben's Padme, but I would argue that in a way, Leia is. Like, without the romantic connotations, Leia is the one that touches his heart and is the turning point and brings him back, and she is the light, and it makes sense because there's the twin sons, and she's one of the sons, and Han Solo helps with that, and it's Ben's memory of him that brings that, and it just, it strikes such a note. And when he says, Dad, and his voice is breaking, and Han says, I know, I'm like, oh! Leia in general, the fact that she's a Jedi is just so amazing. Like, it makes me think back to when I was like 9 years old and I was Princess Leia for Halloween and I had a lightsaber strapped to my belt and I was so proud of myself. And this stupid snotty kid in my school was like, well, Leia doesn't have a lightsaber. Ha! We did see Superman Leia in the past, and I don't need to cling to that the way that I did before, because now we have genuine Jedi Master Leia, as well as her little training scene with Luke, which I will forever be impressed how they're able to make actors look younger. I love her lightsaber. They need to come out with that at Galaxy's Edge. I will buy that. It was right that they returned to Tatooine, and with Leia and Luke looking back on Rey and giving her their blessing, in a sense, and the twin sons, and it was all very reminiscent. It was very nostalgic. You know, there's a lot of nostalgia in this movie. We have the Death Star, we have, you know, the Ewoks show up for a brief second, which makes sense, you know, they're near Endor. We have Tatooine, as I said, with the Jawas and the Sandcrawler. We have a lot. There's Chewie gets his medal, which we have Lando. There's a ton of stuff in this movie that is nostalgic, but if you think that the final piece in a 9-part saga wasn't going to be full of nostalgia and a lot of Star Wars, then you're kind of crazy in a way. I think that that's unrealistic to not have those expectations, you know. I was fine with it. I didn't think it was as heavy-handed as critics are making it sound. I thought that it felt nice. And I think that the way they expanded on Luke and Leia in a way, mostly Leia, you know, they don't expand on Luke all that much, but the treatment that Luke gets, while his scenes are brief, they're much more respectful, I felt, than how The Last Jedi treated him. You know, we get a redeemed Luke. He catches the lightsaber, he tells her, you know, a Jedi's weapon deserves more respect. And that struck me so well. That healed a lot of things for me, I think, because The Last Jedi, it's very disheartening that Luke is the way that he is. I don't totally disagree with how they treated him in a sense of, like, his being a little more hardened, but I did disagree with the journey that it took to, I guess, get him to the place that we have him now. The music of that scene where Rey calls upon the Jedi of the past sounds very familiar to the World Between Worlds, which is kind of what I'm choosing to believe all that comes from, because, you know, it's even the way that they have the voices, like, mixing over one another, and it is very heavily attuned to that. And the visuals, even, it's just space, but, you know, that's what the World Between Worlds looks like as well from Rebels, and I really would appreciate that callback if that's the case. And that would also explain Ahsoka being alive, and everyone's like, well, Ezra's voice isn't in there, so, you know, that means he's alive. And I'm like, yeah, but Ezra really doesn't hit that well with the audiences. You'll notice that everybody who is in that little montage is fairly popular with the audience, and it was really cool to hear Aayla Secura amongst those people as well. And I think Master Luminara is in there too. Yeah, which is pretty neat. And of course Qui-Gon. There's a whole list of Force users that are in there. The prominent ones, of course, being Anakin and Obi-Wan. I would have really killed for an Anakin Force Ghost. I think, because they had his voice in there, I'm willing to let it go, because the Jedi, from my perspective, being like, Rey doesn't take down the Emperor. Even though we know why she has the power to, like, she certainly is emboldened in the sense that her lineage explains why she's so powerful, the same way that Ben is so powerful. I would argue that Ben is more powerful in this movie than Rey. And it's from my perspective, though, that Rey does not destroy Palpatine on her own. You know, she uses the 2 lightsabers, and she is able to totally use the Force to reflect back the Emperor's power and to contain it and stuff, similar to how Yoda does it in Revenge of the Sith. And the reason that she's able to do that is in part because she's so powerful. She can be a vessel for all of these Jedi, but it is the Jedi of the past that are doing that for her. And I think that that's what keeps the whole legacy of Anakin being the chosen one and everything intact. I think that they don't step on any toes with that. It doesn't feel like Anakin's storyline was pointless, to me, at least. I liked that just as much as I actually liked how they used Ben and Rey's Force bond in this movie as well. I thought their relationship was interesting. You know, I'm still not here for the Reylo. J.J. Abrams felt the need, I think, to appease that fan group. To me, it felt like they dropped the whole Finn and Rey thing, and it felt even weirder because he spends the whole movie kind of being like, Rey, I need to tell you something, and really looking after her and being upset over her and everything, and the fact that she's, you know, going off and hurting on her own, as well as the fact that Finn is very clearly, you know, going through some Force stuff of his own, which I liked that they put in there. Again, disappointed that they didn't go through the Stormtrooper past with him. I disagree with the narrative that Rose deserved to be more in this movie. There are certain points where I'm kind of like, well, okay, because Jannah and Zori are both new characters that I didn't really feel like had that big of a purpose. It is a shame that she was sidelined in a way, but I honestly cannot figure out where they should have put her, because the parts where Kerry Russell's character Zori and Jannah are, I don't feel like those characters are all that necessary, particularly Zori. Jannah at least, has her thing in the final battle. Zori kind of felt like a way to force some unneeded edginess on Poe Dameron, which, whatever. I don't even know about that. Oh, and the thing I'm referring to in my review, my spoiler-free review, where I talk about there's this thing that they invent that's really stupid. Why didn't they just do holocrons? They do Sith trackers. That's the dumbest sounding thing I've ever heard. This is what I mean by them just sort of being like, well, whatever about the lore, and just kind of being like, we're just going to call it a Sith tracker, just because we don't think people are going to know what holocrons are. Just explain it really quickly. You have holocrons at Galaxy's Edge. Like, come on, guys. I just want to see more Palpatine, and what we got of him was awesome when his eyes go yellow, and I felt like that whole thing with Ben's turning point, and that he needed to give his life for Rey. Rey dies because the whole power of the universe sucks the life out of her. I don't think she drifts into the Force right away, because she's probably not all the way dead, I guess, at this point. But Ben has to give his life for her. If he really wanted to, he could have left her to die, or he could have, brought her back and shown, and they could have had a nice little vigil for Rey. I mean, in healing her, it's proof that he's fully on the light side again, because dark side Force users cannot Force heal. Now, they can take the life from someone else, but they can't use it altruistically, because that's not an ability of the dark side. So him able to transfer his own life to her, that is definitive proof that we've got him back and that he's on the light side, and Leia not fading into the Force until he's there with her. It's some powerful stuff, This movie is very, very focused on what's happening with Rey and Kylo and Palpatine, and then everybody else kind of gets slid aside, and that is disappointing. I would argue the fact that they weren't fleshed out in the second movie, and that's kind of what kills it, because the final act is always supposed to be focusing on your main thing. Like, we gotta get things wrapped up. We gotta get this story tied as neatly as possible. I overall, though, like the choices that they make and the additions that this makes to canon, as well as the openings it makes for more storytelling. Some people don't like that. They feel like a movie should stand on its own, and I agree with that, but I would argue that this does. It tells the story it's trying to tell. It's not the smoothest ride the entire time. I felt like they atoned for a lot of the things I didn't like about The Last Jedi. But I think if you really love The Last Jedi, you probably hate this movie. So, everything is subjective and everything hurts. I hope you guys enjoyed The Rise of Skywalker. If you didn't, let me know. If you did, also let me know. May the Force be with you. Have a great day. Ow.